So as I alluded to before, when we are talking about labor markets, we are flipping the roles that we are usually assigning to the supply and the demand curve. And I will explain that in a second. So if we are going to talk about the demand for nurses, to keep up with the example that's provided in the book, and we have a downward sloping demand curve, and we have an upward sloping supply curve. The people that are demanding the jobs are the hospitals. Usually we think of demand as consumers, as just households, people like us. In the labor market, the people that are demanding the jobs are the employers, the hospitals here. The people that are supplying the jobs are the nurses, the households. Instead of having a price over on this equilibrium, we're going to have the price of your time. The price of your time, which is a wage, or what we're going to do for the most part, instead of wages, we're going to talk about salaries, right? So that is just your annualized wage, how much you are making in a year. And so the book talks about how, and it uses real data, which is why the supply and demand curves are so wonky in the book, right? So if you see those supply and demand curves and you're like, why are they looking like that? Well, they're looking like that because they're actually finding actual data from the Federal Repository of Economic Data or whatever, and populating and making these. So they're not just theoretical. These are actual observations that we've made in reality, right? So it's going to look a little bit different in the book, but I'll just keep it simple here. So we find that the equilibrium wage for nurses is $70,000. And the equilibrium amount of people would be around 33,000. And so we're asked about what would happen if there was if people were offering higher salaries than 70,000, right? So what if there was an above pay equilibrium of 75,000 that was offered? What would happen? Well, we would just go ahead and we would reflect it off of our demand curve to get our quantity demanded, right? So at 7,500, the nurses demanded declines to $30,000, or 30,000 people. Whereas at 75,000, the amount of people that actually want to be nurses and are applying for this job is at 38,000. So there is going to be a surplus of nurses if this is the equilibrium pay of 8,000 nurses. So this is what we call an excess supply of labor. Questions on that? Pretty straightforward, right? Once we figure out that the roles are flipped, it's pretty much the same thing as before. Nothing new. What if there was a below equilibrium market wage? If there was a below equilibrium market wage, then we are going to get a shortage of nurses, right? At 65,000, or sorry, the book talks about 60,000. At 60,000, quantity supplied is only 27,000. And the quantity demanded goes up to 40,000. So this would be a shortage of 13,000 nurses. So what are some things that are going to impact our supply and demand for labor? So I won't define them all, but we'll just kind of jot them down and talk about them in the context of nurses. So the first one that can impact the demand curve for labor, we'll write this one in blue. So we're going to call these labor demand shifters. So the first one is a pretty straightforward one, but it's also one that we forget about because it's so obvious and straightforward, right? It's the demand for whatever that output is that the business is trying to sell. So in our nurse example, it would be the demand for healthcare. Uh-oh, it's starting to do its wonky thing again. You gotta be careful. So the demand for output. So for healthcare, so it would be as more people get older, as more people survive more diseases and, have, geriatric care and other kind of needs like that, right? There's going to be a greater demand for nurses because there's just a greater demand for medical services. Does that make sense, everyone? Secondly, we've got education and training. If the applicant pool is highly trained and highly productive, then the demand for that particular type of labor is going to increase, right? So the more educated, the more trained the labor pool is, the greater demand the companies will have. Again, ceteris paribus. Yeah, so yeah.
That's not a supply side shifter, that's a demand side shifter?
You have a good point. The supply side shifter is the required education. So we'll talk about that in a second.
But education and training is like what the applicant can do.
Yeah, so this is more just like the general education and training of the country or the state or the community writ large, right? So the demand for labor for some place where everybody has a master's degree is going to be higher than the demand for labor for some place where everybody only has a middle school degree. Does that make sense? So it's about the application pool and how productive they are.
Okay. But
you have a good point that it would fall more on the supply side, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. Yes, that's a very good point. The third one, which I find fascinating, I'm actually writing a paper right now about this, about automation and how automation is either complementing or substituting labor, right? Sometimes automation is going to make labor more productive, like when we have computers and word processors and everything like that, right? It made us all more productive. Sometimes it's going to, so that's a complement, right? That's a technology that complements the actual labor. Sometimes it's going to substitute for that, right? So, the McDonald's has a hamburger flipping machine, right? They also have a thing that, makes the soft drinks now, right? Whereas compare that to before, those soft drinks were all done by some particular worker. All right, I'm gonna need you to close your laptop. Thank you. And everybody stop talking. I'm getting too distracted by everything going on. Thank you. All right, the fourth one is going to be the number of companies. Quite simply, as we have more companies in a particular industry or sector, there's going to be greater demand for that, right? So, if we think about AI and everything like that, right, as there's, ChatGPT and all these different AI platforms emerge, Midjourney and stuff like that, right, there's going to be a greater demand for programmers that are going to be able to, train these things on data sets and stuff like that, right? So machine learning and algorithm programmers. Government regulations are going to impact the demand for labor. Let's say that you're running some sort of, factory, and all of a sudden the government says that, every person has to go through safety training, and they have to wear a high visibility vest, and they have to have a hard hat, and they have to do this and do that, and they have to have so many breaks. Like, as there's increased regulation, the demand for labor is just going to evaporate, right? And they're going to automate, and they're going to try, they're going to do something else. They're going to export it to a different country, whatever the case may be, right? So as government regulations increase, the demand for labor in that particular sector decreases. And then our last one is and this again has to do with technology, is the price and availability of other inputs. So quite simply, let's say there's something that you are doing for the company, and all of a sudden, let's say that you are the engineer in charge of making the ball bearings, right? Well, there's a company in, I think it's Switzerland or something like that, right? They make like all the world's ball bearings. So, essentially it's easier and cheaper for the company to just not have you making those ball bearings and import that finished good into their process. So the price and availability of other inputs are going to determine the relative demand of labor, if you are substitutable by just some sort of market transaction. It's obviously going to be easier. It's going to be better for the firm in the long run. All right, let's talk quickly about labor supply shifters, and then we'll do our Kahoot. So factors that can shift the supply curve of labor. The first one, pretty easy, number of workers. As there's increased immigration, you're going to have more workers, but you also have to watch, you have to look about birth rates and death rates, right? If the birth rate's higher than the death rate, then your population is growing. That's going to shift your supply out. What if you increase the age of retirement, like France just did recently, right? That's going to increase the supply of labor. It's going to shift the supply of labor outwards. So different government policies are going to impact the number of available workers, which is going to impact the relative labor supply. The second one is what you were talking about, Su Yang, the required education. So you really wouldn't just want anybody, or I mean, you wouldn't want me. I have a PhD, but you wouldn't want me doing heart surgery on you, right? You want people that are qualified in order to do the things. And so the supply curve of labor is going to depend on how many people have actually achieved that degree, right? There's there's less people that are nurses compared to physicians. There's, less people that are rocket scientists compared to, technicians and stuff like that, right? And so the required education is going to either shift the supply curve to the right if the required education is dropped, which is actually something that we've been seeing lately. We've been seeing a lot of it, because of the fact that unemployment is low, and businesses, at least up until recently, were hiring at breakneck speed. They were lowering education requirements, which was essentially shifting the labor supply curve to the right. So if there's a decrease in the required education, the supply of labor increases to the right. If there's an increase in the required education, it's going to shift to the left. And lastly, government policies, which honestly relates to the required education, right? There might be some government policies that provide tuition assistance for people that are going to be nurses, or there are government policies in effect right now that provide extra years of a visa if you're here for a STEM program compared to something else, right? So government policies are going to influence the supply of labor, again, within these specific pools that different companies and different sectors are looking at.